From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 14th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival. As we're gathering here already, you're being welcomed in other parts of this place, but it's an amazing and wonderful occasion we have. Today we offer you more than 100 poets, authors, illustrators, for people of all ages and tastes. There are also many interactive offerings for adults as well as children. We realize we all need to interact in all kinds of ways, and reading is the magic for this. Anyhow, I invite you all to stop by the Library of Congress's Pavilion and find out more about the library, which has sponsored this event throughout its excellent history. The library belongs to all of you as well as to the Congress and welcomes anyone over the age of 16 to obtain a reader's card. Use our 21 reading rooms on Capitol Hill, and young readers can enjoy a visit to the library's Young Readers Center in our beautiful Thomas Jefferson building. Anyhow, we most sincerely thank the festival's sponsors, David Rubenstein, as well as Wells Fargo, Washington Post, Institute of Museum and Library Services, the National Endowment for the Arts, PBS, their welcome support, and that of all the many sponsors. This particular event, is made possible by this kind of a public-private partnership. And today, it is my distinct pleasure to award our second Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, which honors an American literary writer whose body of work is distinguished not only for its mastery of the art, but for its originality of thought and imagination. The prize was inspired by a prior award the library made to Herman Wouk in 2008 for his lifetime achievement in fiction. Since then, the prize has been conferred on a pretty distinguished group: Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, Isabel Allende, John Grisham, and last year, under its present name, to Don DeLillo. E.L. Doctorow is the newest recipient of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. And fittingly enough, our previous winner, Don DeLillo, had these words of praise for Doctorow's masterly body of work, and I'm quoting DeLillo. His great topic is the reach of American possibility, in which plain lives take on the cadences of history. Doctorow's prose tends to create its own landscape and to become a force that works in opposition to the power of social reality. The work that E.L. Doctorow has done over the past half-century is extraordinarily impressive. In prize-winning book after prize-winning book, he has channeled America's voices, created a grand gallery of characters, and probed the geography and history of this country with mesmerizing stories and beautifully rendered prose. In every one of his more than a dozen virtuosic voices and works, among them Ragtime, Billy Bathgate, the Book of Daniel, and now Andrew's Brain. He shapes the craft anew, but in all, as George Saunders has said, and I'm quoting again, he sees us clearly and tenderly just as we are, but also sees past that to what we might at our best become. You know, I believe that American originals are one of the glories of this country, and we have before us a very great and unique American original and a magnificent storyteller. He is, in a way, our own Charles Dickens. The great creative canvas of the American experience is his subject. So it's my pleasure to honor him with the 2014 Library of Congress Prize for a Lifetime of American Fiction.
Hear me? Wonderful. Thank you so much for being here this morning. It's such a great pleasure to live in a city that loves books and respects reading. And it's especially wonderful, a thrill really for me, to be sitting here with an author whose works I have admired for so long. And I think you'll agree that it's a thrill to see this prestigious award conferred on such a deserving person who captures the American experience as very few, I think, have, certainly in contemporary times. We're very, very lucky to be giving this award to Doctorow and to have him here, Edgar Doctorow. Thank you so much for being here to receive this award. The Librarian of Congress, James Billington, mentioned the range, the incredible range of Doctorow's work. And so I want to begin by asking you about that, Edgar. Just to take a few books, let's take, for instance, Ragtime, which was an intricate, brightly woven tapestry of American life at the beginning of the 20th century. And then there's the book of Daniel, an extraordinary book, which is a fierce reimagining of the Rosenberg spy trials. And then there is March, The March, which was in itself a novel about the Civil War, in which the central character seemed to me to be the war itself, and raging and methodical, and a book in which I felt I could almost hear the rumble of war throughout. And now then there's Andrew's Brain, which is a book in which we descend deeper and deeper into the psyche of one man, and we find out very soon that he's a highly unreliable narrator. And in some ways, by the end of it, you begin to think he is a little bit like us. So what I want to ask you, Edgar, is we never know what you're going to do next. You always reinvent the craft as you go. How do you do this? How do you make each book sui generis? And what do you have in mind when you go from one book to another and completely do something entirely surprising and different?
I think the key, am I heard? The key word here is desperation. That most of the time I start with an image or even a phrase of music or a phrase of language that I find very evocative. And so I start writing to find out why I've had that feeling. And so basically I end up writing to find out what I'm writing. It's not an entirely rational way to live. But that's the way these books happen, and never with an outline, never with a plan. Of course, with a book like The March, I had an idea that Sherman's March was so unusual for that time that it could provide an armature for a novel. So that was a little different. And the book of Daniel, there was this feeling I'd had for a number of years of just a kind of presiding anger about the early days of the Cold War. And the sense, too, that there was a difference between what was known as the old left in the 1930s and the new left, which arose in the 60s spontaneously from the college campuses. And I thought there that it might be interesting to show 30 years of the life of my country in terms of the dissidents and the radicals. But I had no story until I thought of the Rosenbergs. So sometimes you start with an image, and sometimes just some kind of latent thought that eventually rises to the surface. With Ragtime, after I finished the book of Daniel, I sat around for a year, and I hadn't realized how emotionally exhausted I was by that book. And we were living in New Rochelle, and I had my study on the 3rd floor, and I was looking at the wall. So I started to write about the wall. That's the kind of day you have sometimes as a writer. The wall, and then the house the wall was part of was built in 1902, and then I thought about what New Rochelle looked like in those days and what people were in those days, that women wore parasols in white, men had straw boaters, trolley cars went down to the Long Island Sound, and it was a well-to-do white upper middle class neighborhood, so there were no Negroes, there were no immigrants. And Teddy Roosevelt was president, and I started to run off these images, and pretty soon I was off the wall and onto the book.
That notion of serendipity, because what it is serendipity. You happen to be in a mood, or you catch a glance of something that sets you off and going, is something that, a sense that I have with Edgar's work, a fleeting image, even as he says, desperation. But I remember reading somewhere that the prompt for your book, Loon Lake, was actually seeing a sign on a highway.
That's correct. We were up there in the Adirondacks. It was a very meaningful part of the world for me. And we drove past a sign that said Loon Lake, and I liked the sound. I liked those two words, Loon Lake. You see how silly this can be. And then I went home and sort of put that phrase together with my sense of the territory, the beautiful Adirondacks. And I did know that it was a habit of the wealthy in past ages to make the wilderness a very hospitable place for them, and to build luxurious camps for themselves, and to come up there by means of private railroad cars. And then I thought about that and the phrase Loon Lake, and that's how the book developed.
Well, there's another example that I'm reminded of, and he wrote about this for the Washington Post. As a matter of fact, when I was the literary editor there, he very kindly wrote a piece for the Post at the time. And Edgar, you said that it was almost magical, really. He was looking, he was puzzling over. He wanted a character to go from, I think it was from New York or the Bronx to Lowell, Massachusetts.
Oh, yes.
And you wanted that character to do it on a trolley car, and you didn't know whether it was possible. And suddenly, you know, he was sitting in a library looking at a shelf.
Yes. Well, what happened was I wrote this scene where Tata and his little girl take trolley cars from New York to Massachusetts. I wanted them to go to a place where there were knitting mills, and there was going to be a big strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. And so I wrote that scene, but I had no idea if it was possible for someone to take trolley car after trolley car, come to the end of one line, put a nickel in, and go on to the next line. And I thought I'd better research that. And this was the days before Google, you understand. So I went to the library, and and walked through the stacks, and I just didn't know how I was going to find this out, what I needed to know. And I saw a shelf of oversized books sticking out, and I banged my knee against one of these books. So I lifted it off the shelf, and it turned out to be a corporate history of trolley cars in America. And if someone asks me about research, that's my example of how I do it.
You make it sound so easy. I'm sure it's not all that easy. But when magic does happen, you're there to receive it. Edgar, you grew up in the Bronx. We not only know this from Wikipedia, but because you have captured it so well in your books. You've reflected your childhood, really, in books like Billy Bathgate or World's Fair, especially I think of your childhood in that book. When you were a boy, your father owned a music store in Manhattan, and I believe Horowitz and Stokowski and Heifetz and all the great musicians of the world came in to sort of shoot the breeze with your dad. Yeah. And there were books in the house. Your grandfather was a printer by trade, if I remember correctly, and he was something of an intellectual. He liked to read. And there were always books in the house, and you were always reading. How did your childhood shape you as a writer?
Well, nowadays they call that kind of a childhood an enriched childhood, but it was just life as I experienced it. My family were all readers. My mother, father, older brother were just readers. And these were days before there were all these distractions and toys like iPhones and all that sort of thing. So if you wanted to go to a movie, you had to go to a theater. And books were really the daily sustenance. Books and music. It turned out that there was a lot of music in the house too, because my father was in the business, and my brother had organized a jazz band when he was a teenager. My mother was a superb pianist, and they were all into music and books. There's no money, you understand, but I tried my hand at music, but it wasn't working out too well. And I announced one day that I no longer wanted to take piano lessons, and nobody in the family objected when I said that. But as I said last night, somehow the music and the music and words elided in my mind, so that I think that was quite important for me to have that environment. And I was also supported by my teachers. They were always very supportive when you did a book report or something like that. And if a teacher said, "Edgar, this is very good, you ought to do more of this." Well, a child is incredibly inspired by a teacher's approval, a grade school. Of course, then I started to write. Edgar Allan Poe, I've been named after him, so my first writing were Poe-like stories. I remember one story began with this line: "The cell was dark and dank." But then I passed through my Poe phase, and by the time I got to Science High School, I was into Kafka in a big way. So I wrote a story called The Beetle. My version of etymological self-defamation. And but I also had an experience in high school that was very crucial. I took a class in journalism just because I wanted to write, and I found it not terribly interesting until we were given the assignment of doing an interview. So I went to town on that, and I turned an interview with the stage doorman at Carnegie Hall. His name was Carl. I've told this story before. He was a German Jewish refugee who barely escaped from the Nazis in Europe. And he came to work every evening dressed in a baggy jacket, a blue jacket, and mismatching brown pants. And he brought his lunch in a paper bag and a thermos of tea. And he would drink the tea in the old European way by putting a cube of sugar between his teeth and drinking the tea through his sugar. And all the great musicians and artists loved him and knew him and called him Carl. And they also respect the fact that he was very knowledgeable about the repertoire, classical repertoire. So I handed in this interview, and the next day the teacher called me up after class to her desk, and she said, "Edgar, in all the years I've been teaching this class, this is the best interview I've ever had. It's so good that I want to print it in the school newspaper. So what I want to do is send one of the photography kids down to Carl to take his picture to go along with the story." Well, I hadn't expected that kind of a reaction. And I said, I don't think that's possible. She said, "Why not?" I said, "Well, Carl's very shy." And she said, "Shy? How shy can he be? He talked to you, didn't he?" I said, "Well, not exactly." There is no Carl. I made him up. That was a bad day at the Bronx High School of Science. But I thought how much better it was to make something up than go through the tedious business of interviewing someone.
So much for it. Well, that was the end of his journalistic career, as you can imagine.
That's right. It was a portent for my future, but neither I nor the teacher understood that. I graciously accepted the F I got for the day.
I want to talk a little bit about your current book, the most recent novel, which is an extraordinary work, Andrew's Brain. And Dr. Billington had said you channel American voices, which you do in all of your books. But there's something about Andrew's Brain that made me feel that you were channeling America's voice, really. There was a sense of, even though we feel that we're on some sort of hallucinatory ride with this narrator whom, we trust, and then we're told not to trust, and then we're hearing these extraordinary stories from this man's life. And I had a sense throughout that it was almost, there was an echo of great sort of a contemporary American angst and psyche and all of that in it. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, and I will hope that you will explain how did Andrew emerge? How did he become your character? And such a compelling book. You must all read it, please.
Well, I had an image for this book that I began with. And the image, and I don't know where it came from, is an image of a man standing in front of a house, waiting for the door to open, and he's holding in his arms an infant, a swaddled infant, and it's snowing. And that's what I wrote down. And I said, well, what is this about? Who is he? And what I noticed that this was a description in the third person. And someone was telling this, someone was saying this to someone else. And so I started to write. No, I'm strong enough to hold this out.
Can you all hear us at this point? You can?
I should speak into, no. Oh, it's
for me.
Oh.
All right.
This is a high-tech society we're in.
I'm so sorry. You were saying about the voice.
So it turns out that this fellow Andrew was speaking of himself in the third person. And I thought that was interesting. And somehow or other, the book devolved as someone named Andrew talking to someone who might be his shrink, but who might not be. So the book is someone doing most of the talking, Andrew, and someone doing most of the listening, the fellow who he calls Doc. And I realized I was breaking some rules of how fiction is written. Just in the same way I've always felt, beginning with the Carl the Stage Doorman story in the high school, that something worked for me when I felt I was transgressing, when I was breaking rules. And the rules I was breaking in this book were, among them was to make no distinction between what was real and what was imagined. There's no way of telling in this book what the truth is. And there I remembered Picasso's statement, whatever you can imagine is real. Another possible title for the book that I had in mind was from was the phrase from Thoreau, "In dreams awake," "In dreams awake." And turns out that the book is constructed of a series of leitmotifs that Andrew comes back to again and again and again. His preoccupation with Mark Twain, he notices birds quite a bit. There's circus imagery that occurs in one form or another. His questions about computers. He's occupied with thinking about computers. And he is a cognitive scientist. And so he worries about the great question that neuroscientists and cognitive scientists are facing today, is how does the brain become the mind? How does that 3-pound knitting ball in our heads give us consciousness and all the feelings and thoughts that make us human? And he worries about that. He knows, he accepts the fact that there's no such thing as the soul. That has been repudiated by modern science. But the question then is, well, how does the brain do it? And Andrew's very preoccupied with this central idea that the soul was ours, but the brain is itself. And at one point he says in the book, how can I think about my brain if it's my brain doing the thinking? So this is the kind of preoccupation that has, and oh yes, it's also a love story. It turns out that the baby that Andrew has at the first scene belongs to his late young wife, Bryony. So before we ever get to his courtship of Bryony, we know that she's dead. So what I finally felt about this book was that it was not in chapters, it was in stanzas. And that there were different ways to read the book, that one could read it literally as Andrew talking and Doc listening. One could read it as saying, none of this is true, none of this happened. This is Andrew thinking. And the third way to read it, as a smart reviewer said this, is to read it as the workings of Doctorow's brain. And so it's the kind of book that really judges the reader somehow. But it did turn out to be, you see, fiction is a very conservative art. If you think about music, in the early 19th century, there was Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, blew them all away. If you think about art, there were the Impressionists, and then followed by Picasso and Braque and the Cubists, and then art went on to the abstract expressionists. And the poets, of course, Whitman in the middle of the 19th century blew them all out of the water. But what about fiction? Well, this insistence always on telling the story the same way regulates us. And while there has been Joyce, Finnegan's Wake, and well, I'm trying to think of 3 or 4 exceptions to this rule. There aren't that many. And Joyce was a dead end. You couldn't follow him. Virginia Woolf wanted to write a book without a plot, and she did that. But somehow the tide always comes back to formulaic fiction, portrayals of reality, imitating reality. So if you do this work long enough, you get the feeling that you want to make it new. That was what Ezra Pound said to the poets. He said, make it new. And that's what I tried to do.
It's a remarkable book and very, very new in its method and its brilliance. We have time for a few questions. If you would like to take the microphones here, please do so at this time. I'm going to ask a very quick question while you do that. There will be very few questions, I'm afraid, because of our time. But as you're lining up, let me ask E.L. Doctorow this question. We know him for so long now as a distinguished American writer that we perhaps forget that he was for quite a while also a distinguished American editor. He was the editor-in-chief of Dial Press. He was at the New American Library for many years. Just very quickly so that other people can ask you questions, Edgar, how did your editorial career affect your writing brain, shall we say?
It was very useful because as I edited other people's work, I was, of course, very objective about it. This belonged, this should be shifted around, you don't need this at all. All the things you do, you get your hands into a manuscript the way a thoracic surgeon gets his hands into a body. And what I learned from that, from editing Mailer and James Baldwin and a bunch of other people, I learned to be as objective about my own work as I was about others, and that turned out to be very useful.
Indeed, indeed. First question over here, young woman, please.
Is it working? Okay. I just wanted to ask, I don't know if you've heard of Michael Schmidt's...
Could you speak into the microphone, please?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask you if you've heard of Michael Schmidt and his book, A Novel, a Biography, because in that book, he says that the closest thing to the great American novel is Ragtime. And I wanted to know if you were aware that he said that and how you feel about that.
Did you hear that?
Yes, I did hear that. I think he's a very smart critic.
Short answer. Thank you. Over here, please.
Yes, I'm a graduate of Kenyon College, and I believe that is your alma mater, and you overlap with Paul Newman and Jonathan Winters. I'd like to know how that collegiate experience with the literary tradition, Kenyon Review, Robert Lowell, John Crow Ransom, how did those collegiate years affect your development as a writer?
The years at Kenyon.
Your collegiate opinion, yes.
Yeah, it was an invaluable education. It was called a liberal education, which I firmly believe in, and I worry now that too many of the kids are so job-oriented that they turn their educations into essentially vocational occasions. But I studied English and philosophy and history, and I had some great teachers. And I think in those days, in the 1950s, the late poet John Crow Ransom was there. The best two-man philosophy department in the country persuaded me, just listening to them, to turn to philosophy. And it was probably the best undergraduate college at that time in the country, I think. But I wonder why you asked that question. You were an alumnus of Kenyon College?
Yeah, 20 years ago. but I published a book on the Kenyan mafia surrounding Abraham Lincoln. There's a whole Kenyan clique that got him the nomination and ran his war cabinet, but we can talk about that later.
Well,
but I salute you.
We had, we were aware of the golden age of Kenyan writers. Robert Lowell was one. One of my classmates was the poet James Wright. And it was just, and you mentioned Paul Newman. He was a senior when I was a freshman. And when he left Kenya, I began to get some decent roles in the drama club.
Thank you for your question. Over here, please.
Sure, honor. Born in the Bronx, my father, same year, born as you, he went to DeWitt Clinton. But my wife and I are in the Broadway industry in New York City. And one of our favorite musicals is Ragtime, and knowing some people involved with that. It's one of the great musicals.
What? I didn't hear that.
And curious, what kind of input, if any, you had, besides saying yes to letting Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty do the musical, what kind of input did you have, and what did you feel about that translation into a musical, especially with your love of music?
Is it to do with the musical?
Yes. What sort of involvement did you have with the musical? To what extent did you affect it?
When this idea was proposed to me, I was very reluctant to agree to it. I made some terms that I would have approval of the lyricist, of the composer, of the librettist, and I was given that. And then I worried as they got busy and working, until I realized that the same thing had happened to Victor Hugo and George Bernard Shaw. Mm-hmm. Of course, they were safely dead at the time. Nevertheless, these people were incredible, and whenever they went off the rails, I was asked to help out, and I delivered many, many notes over the 2-year period of the development of that show. In fact, the notes I delivered to them were thicker than the original book. But they did a good job. It's beautiful music, and while I think the ending is softer than the book is, they don't have the insouciance and the naughtiness that's in that book. The book keeps its distance from the characters, kind of told as an historical chronicle, but you can't do that in a musical when people go around singing about their feelings. There's no distance, so it's different, but it looks like Ragtime, and I'm very happy with it.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are out of time and we need to close this program, but I want you to give a very large hand to the winner of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction, Edgar Doctorow. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.